Hello, and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the Mexico Grand Prix. And it was a very good Grand Prix, a lot of talking points. It certainly wasn't quite the procession that we've been used to. There was excitement at the beginning, excitement at the middle, and excitement at the end of the race. Now, if you're noticing something missing from the beginning of this podcast, the introduction music, that means I've unfortunately lost a Creative Commons license battle with the person that originally created the music. I layered over the top the Formula One sounds, as you might have guessed. If you do hear music, that means I have won the Creative Commons battle, which, by the way, is irrevocable. This is why hopefully being a lawyer pays off in the world of amateur podcasting, but we'll find out. Anyway, on to the race, marshals. Well, on to qualifying first. Qualifying was interesting. I've got a few notes on qualifying for us to go through. Albon out again in Q1. Not been a good time for Albon. Sainz has really hit the form out of the two Williams drivers. I think Williams are struggling a bit because they put so much emphasis on next year's car. We've discussed that before, but I still think Albon was going to be bitterly disappointed because you're seeing Sainz be able to get into Q2. Albon stuck down in lowly Q1 at the moment. Not very good. The other thing to note, Piastri's PU problem, the engine energy deployment when he was coming out of, I'm going to say turn 5 from memory, might have been turn 6 in his Q2 run. That was interesting, showing maybe something up with the car. The theories that his engine is being turned down are completely false, by the way. Piastri would be very vocal on that. The PU thing obviously fueled some of the conspiracy theory around that, but it's nonsense. And the most telling thing is actually the interview that Piastri did at the very end of the race on Sunday, where he talked about driving style and where Lando had changed his driving style over the last few races and Piastri hadn't, to adapt to the tyres at these races. And he thinks that's where Lando's managed to find some more performance. Although he did reiterate he's driving exactly the same way he did at the beginning of the season, but adaptability, particularly as the cars and the races evolve, is very important in being a world champion. So perhaps Piastri will learn from this. Bearman was the next one into Q3. And we'll talk a lot about Oliver Bearman, aren't we? But I just noticed he went into Q3 again because he's very quick, that boy. We'll talk a lot more about him later on. And then the other thing that took me was when Leclerc found 7 tenths between Q2 and Q3. That was remarkable. And we have now seen a massive closing of the gap between Lewis and Leclerc, which is very good ahead of next season. For Lewis fans, and I think generally for racing, we want to see Lewis being able to qualify in a much higher position. First time he'd qualified in the top 3 all year. And he was really excited about that. And the reason why I was so excited, because he was up there with Charles Leclerc, one of the best qualifiers of all time, who got P2 with that ridiculous, as I say, 7 tenths fine between Q2 and Q3. But Purple Super Lando, that was an incredible lap. Absolutely incredible. In fact, there were multiple incredible laps throughout that qualifying session. And this weekend, qualifying and the race, was the first pure dominance performance that we've seen from Lando Norris. And that's interesting because you need those performances to be world champion typically at some point. When the opportunity came, when Piastri did not qualify high enough and left himself exposed, Lando Norris took advantage. So, a good qualifying. Now, on to the race, and we're going to start with turn 1. Did Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, Oscar Piastri all deserve penalties? I think the simple answer to this is yes. Max gets a great run. There's 4 abreast going into turn 1, but he is in the track. He knows where he's putting the car. And he goes straight across, cuts multiple corners, and slots back in. Does give up a bit of track position, but we're going to come on to Max again in a second. Charles Leclerc fighting alongside Lewis. Lewis gets a better start than Charles was expecting. Can't close him out. Fair racing, but Charles Leclerc has a bit of oversteer, snaps, realises he can't make the corner, cuts across. And this is the important bit, ladies and gentlemen, because unlike a lot of commentators, I actually have read the driving standards, and I want to read you this paragraph. Giving back a lasting advantage. Should a car leave the track, the driver may rejoin. However, this may only be done when it is safe to do so, and without gaining any lasting advantage. Now, all drivers did when it was safe to do so. I think we can be comfortable with that. But without gaining a lasting advantage. That's very important. At the absolute discretion of the race director, a driver may be given the opportunity to give back the whole of any advantage he gained by leaving the track. Interesting use of he. Bit uncomfortable that, isn't it? In modern rule drafting, the use of he rather than they. But hey, all the drivers are currently male. So, what do we want to interpret from this? How do you measure gaining a lasting advantage? Is it you just have to slot back in the same position you were at the time you left the track? Or by rejoining in the same place, is that gaining a lasting advantage because you failed to make the corner and you otherwise would have had to slot in lower down? Now, I know there is some interpretation from the stewards of first corner waiver, and that has been used throughout multiple Grand Prix, but it was clear, even for a lot of the drivers, they were very unhappy with the decision the stewards reached in this, where effectively it gave drivers carte blanche to overbrake themselves, not make the corner. Now, not all drivers necessarily going wide have overbraked themselves. Some might not be given room on the inside, but I think it was pretty clear in Max and Charles' case, which was definitely the most controversial, that lack of control of the car led to them cutting corners and resulted in them gaining a lasting advantage. So, come back onto that later, because cutting the track becomes more relevant. Now, having covered the Turn 1 lawn-mower grass cutting shenanigans, the next major incident I want to talk about, which has been a huge talking point, a lot of time spent reviewing this, is the Max versus Lewis coming together, going off the track, and whether or not there was another lasting advantage. But again, we're going to turn to the driver standards because I think it's actually very useful to review these in the context of what the stewards are judging the drivers against. So, let's have a look at overtaking on the inside. Now, as a refresher, Max, in the first series of these corners, moves down the inside of Lewis in the right-hander, and that's where the overtaking starts. And there's shortly another left-hander as well, where Max also leaves the track. So, the first one, overtaking the inside. This is what the guidelines say. To be entitled to be given room when overtaking on the inside, the overtaking car must, 1. Have its front axle at least alongside the mirror of the other car, prior to and at the apex. I think we can be comfortable that was the case with Max. Some people have criticised whether or not this needs changing because of lunging, but actually, let's keep reading the guidelines. Part 2. The overtaking car must be driven in a fully controlled manner, particularly from entry to apex, and not have dived in. Now, possibly a little bit of discussion around this. Max does love a dive in. In this, did he dive in? Was he in control of the car? He doesn't lock up, but there is contact with Lewis. Does that help him make the corner? There's some discussion around that. He does have a big overspeed. The gap is there. We want to encourage overtaking. I think there is some genuine debate around this, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt for the sake of playing through the guidelines. Part 3. The overtaking car must, in the steward's estimations, let's take on the role of the stewards, have taken a reasonable racing line and been able to complete the move whilst remaining within track limits. Now, reasonable racing line, yes, I think that's true. Complete the move whilst remaining within track limits. Now, there is the contact with Lewis. Does that help him stay in? I think he would complete the move staying within track limits without the contact with Lewis. So, does Max be deserved to give him the room? Okay. Through that first bit of the corner, you could say he's ticked off those things. Now, the contrary to that is Lewis still entitled to try and go for that corner where he is? He's started to give Max room. Room probably has been given. Lewis fairly tries to make the corner. There's a bit of contact. It's racing. Lewis himself wasn't super bothered about that part. So, at this point then, are we saying that Max is ahead? He's the lead car. Going into what will now be the left-hander. And this is where it's interesting. Do we consider Lewis, if Max is the lead car now, is Lewis now overtaking on the inside? Or is the move still ongoing and Max is now trying to complete an overtake on the outside of the corner? Let's have a look at the overtake on the outside guidelines. Overtake on the outside will always be viewed as a more difficult maneuver to accomplish. To be entitled to be given room, including at the exit, when overtaking on the outside, the overtaking car must 1. Have its front axle ahead of the front axle of the other car at the apex. Now, if we consider Max to still be an overtaking car, does he have his front axle ahead of the front axle of the other car at the apex? The answer is yes. I've looked at the footage. 2. Be driven in a controlled manner from entry to apex and to exit. Yes, he's in control of his car. 3. Be able to make the corner within track limits. Now, he doesn't. He cuts the corner. He isn't able to make the corner within track limits. So, if Max is still an overtaking car at that point, he has cut the corner whilst not having completed an overtake. Now, the relevant part here is they have a section, chicanes and S-bends. Let's bore you with it. The above guides for inside and outside may apply to each element of the combination. Generally, priority will be given to the first corner element. So there's judgment in this. Is it a single interaction? Is it a dual interaction? Is Max already ahead? This is why it can actually get quite difficult for the stewards to decide and why you might disagree with them. Now, the other way of viewing the second part of the corner is that Max actually is ahead. Part 1's taken place, but Lewis, has he fulfilled the criteria for overtake on the inside? Is his front axle at least alongside the mirror of the other car prior to and at the apex? Yes, it is. Is he being driven in a fully controlled manner from entry to apex and not have dived in? Yes, he's not dived in because he's already alongside. It's through the first part of the corner. In the steward's estimation, has he taken a reasonable racing line? Yes. And been able to complete the move whilst remaining inside the track limits? Yes. So, if you view Lewis as an overtaking car in the second part, he's complied with all the elements of the overtake in the corner, and he would have deserved the corner and the overtake. Now, because Lewis has gone in defending and these series of corners, I actually think you would consider them together. And you've got to ask, through these two interactions, the overtake on the inside and then the overtake on the outside by Max, or you view it as Lewis overtake on the inside, has Max done enough to deserve the place ahead? And in my opinion, on reading the guidelines, I would say no, not quite. The defending has been robust. You've got some good racing. Had Max been able to make the second corner, then I think very clearly he would have won that battle, that overtaking series, and he would be entitled to be ahead. But he doesn't. He cuts the corner and gains an advantage. Now, he cuts the corner and he does drop back a bit to allow Lewis and George to catch up a bit. But my point would be, he's cut the corner and gains the lasting advantage and hasn't completed the overtaking move, with whichever way you read the driver's stewards. So there, I think the stewards have made a mistake, and Max would have had to have given, I'm not saying he gets a huge 10-second penalty, but should have given up the place to Lewis. Now it becomes tricky, because George is there, and the same thing we'll see in a second when Bearman gets the overtake on Max, and Lewis is ahead. How do you give back the place when there's other cars muddying the waters? It's very difficult. So, into the next corner, we then have Lewis, who is clearly behind Max, and George is clearly behind Lewis. They come up to the corner, and Lewis locks his inside front, and he's not able to make the corner, and he goes straight on. He's carrying too much speed, and he can't go down the escape road. Now, the stewards have said, due to reasonable excessive speed, they didn't penalise him for not going down the escape road. He comes out ahead of the fight behind him, which we'll cover in a second as well, and he doesn't give up his lasting advantage. Now, we covered that at the beginning with the corner cutting. What the team should have done is inform Lewis to give up that advantage he had taken. But he feels aggrieved because he already thinks Max has cut the corner previously and he's gained a lasting advantage, which he hasn't given up. And so where Lewis has done the same at the next corner, not given up, I think Ferrari think that's cancelled one another out. And I certainly think Lewis does at that moment in the race. But did Ferrari need to play the steward a bit and play a bit of a game and make Lewis back off right to the point of Bearman and Max and then carry on from there? I think so. Let's explore Max a bit further though in this corner. He also doesn't make the corner where Lewis goes off. He comes back and rejoins the track in a bid to make the next right-hander. But when he does, George Russell is there. Max is ahead of the corner. He's defending on the inside. And ultimately, George goes wide. Now, there are factors that can be taken into account when looking at this. We'll read through them. The stewards are also considering, how did the cars get into the incident? Was the manoeuvre later optimistic? What could the drivers reasonably see, know or anticipate? Do we believe the manoeuvre could have been completed on the track? Was there understeer, oversteer, locking? Did someone position handle their car in a way that contributed to the incident? Did the type of corner contribute to the incident? What were the relative tyres, tyre age, grip? Now, of those, I would say, how did the cars get into the incident is relevant to when Max and George come together. Max is rejoining the track, having just not made a corner. He is ahead, but he's desperately trying to stay ahead. And I think there's an argument, I'm not saying it's clear cut, but there's an argument that George should have been given more room on the outside. Now, I don't think it's the biggest breach of the guidelines. It may not even be a breach of the guidelines. We want to encourage racing. I'm not just trying to have an absolute go at Max in every single instant here. Of all of the things up to this, I think it's the weakest, but it's worth observing. And ultimately, he loses the place because Bearman nips down the inside. Disappointing for George, but is that racing? Possibly. Where I think George has a right to be really grieved is the failure of corner cutting to be penalised. And so the only penalty we saw was a 10-second penalty applied to Lewis. If you look at the penalty guidelines, again, I'm sad enough to read them, they can give a 5 seconds here. And I think that actually would have been proportionate. When you look at how close the cars are at the moment, what 10 seconds can mean, where it can drop you, given the level of breach here, so Lewis not giving up time, if you think that he's deemed to, if you think he should have given up time, same with Max, Charles, etc. I think we probably just needed a series of 5-second penalties, and it wouldn't have killed the race, but it would have penalised drivers fairly and rewarded drivers fairly for those who stayed on track, raced fairly, and so on. Now, that was very technical. It's taken me a few takes to get there, but I thought it might be informative to just go through the driving standards. So let me know what you think. Maybe have a look at the driving standards yourself. Maybe come to your own decision. Is there any that you want to change? Again, let me know. I've been banging on about driving standards for far too long, so let's rattle through the other stuff. The other big moments for me, George and Antonelli team orders. Mercedes waited too long. I think George did have the pace. George is the driver that is still theoretically in the championship battle, mathematically in the championship battle. I thought there was an opportunity there to swap and give the position back like they did, and had they acted earlier, I think George would have had a better go at getting past Bearman. Next up was Tsunoda's strategy and not pitting. And he spoke about after the race, and whatever NDA he has signed is incredibly strong. He was just used as a blocker. There is no two ways about it. He was entirely there to sit on old tyres, getting in the way and being an obstacle for other drivers to support Max. There's nothing else. I know that the drive relationship's fallen. I think the writing's on the wall for Yuki. I don't think he'll have a drive next year now. He was very disappointed at the end of the race. He said he felt that within the constraints of which he's allowed to race, what his position and what he's there in Red Bull to do, he felt he did a good job, but he went just short of actually saying he's just used as a blocking pawn. But he gave it a pretty good go to say as much when you read between the lines. Next up, Oliver Bearman. I thought he was very good. The Haas pit stops were excellent as well to support him. He deserved to be where he was because he was putting in great lap times, really good lap times, competitive lap times. And when it was the big moment of deciding whether to pit him to cover an undercut and Max stayed out, I think ultimately when you see actually the time delta that Max managed to gain on Charles in front of him, Bearman was probably toast had he stayed out and not pitted. So Oliver Bearman staying where he did, managing to finish in P4, extraordinary. They made the right decision to pit there. They nailed the pit stop. And I also liked his aggressiveness. He spoke after the race. He said, got to fight back the same way. He was talking about Max's driving style. And I think he did that when he went wheel to wheel with Max in that corner. Spent too long together. But I was just so impressed with the lap times he put in again and again. And that's where I see really quality racing drivers, is where they can put in near quali laps in a race, lap after lap after lap, and can either make ground, hold ground, or eat ground when they need to. So, very impressed. He's aggressive and he knows when to make a move. Jacques Villeneuve there, and I agree. The strategy, a bit to talk on the strategy, the softs just lasted so much longer. Very curiously, the track 10 degrees hotter than FP1 helped the tyre longevity, which is not normally the case from my understanding of how the Pirelli tyres work, but I thought that was interesting. And it allowed Max to do that mega stint at the last and catch up with Charles. And when he did catch up, I think it was probably 60-40 Max getting past Charles at that point before this virtual safety car was flagged for Sainz. And I think it was disappointing. I'd like to have seen that because Charles is a really good defender, can position his car very well. And Max is an incredibly aggressive overtaker for all the reasons we covered earlier in this podcast. So a real shame we didn't get to see it. Should that be taken into account when the race director is looking at safety? Yes, but spectator viewing is probably the most minor of the reasons of whether or not you should be flagging a safety car or not. If it was the other way around and they let it run and it was slightly dangerous and something had happened, they would be absolutely slammed. And safety is very important in the sport. But when you see where the car was parked, although they didn't show us live, did they? Again, incredibly infuriating, some of the camera work going on in Formula One races at the moment. But when we did eventually see where Sainz's car was parked, it was maybe disproportionate to pull a full virtual safety car, and the double waved yellows could have been sufficient whilst it was moved further away from the barrier and the race could conclude. Oscar at the end. We've talked about Oscar, haven't we? Saying he needs to change a few ways he's driving and his use of the tyres. Yeah, I think this is very interesting for the championship battle. Lando Norris is now leading. He's definitely got the momentum. He's looking incredibly strong. The McLaren was stronger this weekend, which was good because last weekend I was saying it was conceivable that Max Verstappen could win every remaining race. So it's nice to have that not be the case and it be a bit closer, but it's going to come down to the wire here. One DNF changes everything. There's still races to go. And we go to Brazil where, God, it's a great race. I'm really excited for Brazil. There could be contact. There's often contact between drivers in Brazil. There can be some great overtaking. Yeah, going to be really exciting. My current money, I think the performance from Oscar and the tyres was telling, and I wasn't actually expecting him to be so far behind. I thought when the McLaren, if it did come back, Lando and Oscar would be a bit more on a par again, but the gulf between them in speed and the confidence that Lando has at the moment, if it's not going to get shaken, I can't see him losing that for the rest of the season, and it can take a few races sometimes to just gain back the momentum. Oscar's got a fortnight to recuperate and reassess the situation, and he's a very talented driver, so he can come back, but is it that bit of experience playing out between them? These really small differences between Lando and Oscar. Temperament's different. The speed, is it different? We've spoke so much about this through the year, but a little feeling, I think it was justified this weekend just when you saw how imperious, how superb Lando Norris was. And we're going to finish Marshals. We've covered a lot of stuff today. I just want to talk about George Russell being in the stands, putting on the Mexican wrestling mask and hiding in the stands. I thought was brilliant. And rest assured, Mercedes George fans, Mercedes fan. This is the Japanese hat, by the way. Signed by Lewis Hamilton, supposedly. May not be, but let's pretend. It's definitely signed by Lewis Hamilton. I think it is. Why would I spend all the money on it if it wasn't signed by Lewis Hamilton? Question for a philosopher. George Russell has a performance clause in his contract, so that if he meets a certain performance milestone next year, his contract will automatically renew for 2027. Marshals, good news. We go to Brazil. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I hope I get my intro and outro music back and I win this Creative Commons license battle. It's great. I really love it. So please let me use it. I'll catch you next time, Marshals, for Brazilian Grand Prix.